Joining us today for our third and final webinar of our MotioCI 3.0 series. This is Holly Rice. I am the marketing coordinator for Motio, and with me today is Adam Bono, senior software engineer for the MotioCI product team. Adam will be talking to you about Cognos data validation and demonstrating how you can leverage MotioCI to verify the accuracy of your BI content. As a reminder, today's webinar will be recorded and a short Q&A session will follow Adam's presentation. So feel free to submit any questions in the panel throughout the presentation. Are you ready to get started, Adam?
I am.
Okay.
All right, so just a quick little run through the agenda here. We are going to spend pretty much all of our time looking at a few different examples of the types of data validation that you can do through the MotioCI application. So I'm going to start off showing my screen, and I'm going to talk very briefly about the idea of data validation and the benefits of automating it through a tool like MotioCI. And then we're going to go through examples of how you can, first of all, compare against fixed values. So that's basically spot checking, and actually that's what a lot of companies with dedicated BI teams do. They write up test cases that say to run a certain report with certain prompt page values, and then just to look at certain values in that report, make sure they match the expected fixed values they want to look at. We also give you the ability to do comparisons of values within your output, so you can do logical comparisons. For example, if you want to make sure that the values in two separate cells are equal, maybe it's a sum of the debits over some period of time, sum of the credits over some period of time. Of course, those are expected to be equal, and you can do that type of logical comparison. You can also do logical comparisons on ranges of cells. So for example, you can select a column and add those values together and compare that value, that result, with a single summarized value that contains the total for the column. You can also do comparisons against previous outputs of a given report. So if you want to verify the stability of your report over time, you can do that. You can look at the entire report output, or you can actually look at just individual parts of the report output to make sure that those are staying the same. You can compare against values across separate reports. So for example, if you have a summary and a detail report, then in the summary report you can select a column, again, or a row, or any range of values, and you can sum them up, you can take the average, you can do any kind of statistical manipulation you want. And then you can compare them against the corresponding cell in the, actually I think I said summary and detail backwards there, but you can compare the aggregation of values from a detail report against the single cell in the summary report that corresponds to those values. You can also do comparison across your environments. So for example, you may want to understand the differences in your current output in development versus what you would get if you ran the same report in production right now. We give you the ability to do that, and once again also to select parts of the report for the purposes of comparison. So for example, if you're developing a report and working on a certain column, you want to make sure that all of your other columns stay the same. You can do exactly that, and you can compare against production in the process to make sure that you're not going to disrupt your content. And then the final thing we're going to point out is that you can actually compare against external data. So you're not limited just to what's accessible through Cognos. You're actually able to select values from your report, for example, a column, and enter, just as one example, the SQL that you need to run in order to pull those values from your underlying data warehouse or even your transactional system. So when you put those things together, you can actually do real-time validation of the output of your report against its underlying data sources to make sure they're being processed in the correct way. So with that said, I am going to go ahead and share my screen and show you the MotioCI application and how we approach data validation. So I'm pretty sure that everybody listening on this call already knows the value of data validation, because I think it's fair to say that literally every single Cognos customer does data validation in some form or another. Like I mentioned earlier, there are companies that have dedicated QA departments that run through formal test cases, doing spot checks, maybe even also doing manual logical checks. But even the smallest shop is at least going to do the data validation in the form of running a report, looking at it directly, making sure it looks right, makes sense before they put it out in front of end users. The real value of the MotioCI tool isn't just in the ability to do your data validation programmatically so that you eliminate human error. It's also the fact that you can auto-generate certain types of data validation test cases, and maybe even more importantly, the fact that you can automate the running of these test cases so that you can consistently, frequently check your reports in all kinds of different ways to make sure that your data is correct. So that's something that will save you time and money because, of course, running through test cases manually if you have a QA department is a very, very expensive thing. It also improves the quality of the BI data you end up providing to your end users because you're able to do much more thorough and much more frequent testing. So here's the game plan for showing you the actual data validation feature in MotioCI. I'm actually just going to make a very, very simple change to a report here. I'm not going to try to do anything too convoluted because I want us to focus on the flexibility and the ease of automation of MotioCI testing rather than worrying too much about just exactly what it is I did to the report. So I'm actually going to make kind of a silly change here. In this report called Consumer Trends, we have a list at the bottom, and one of the things in that list is the revenue calculation. And we're just going to go ahead and multiply that by 2, which is, of course, a very artificial thing to do. But the key point here is it doesn't matter where your changes come from, why you're getting different data values in your outputs. It could be that a report author made a mistake, a new framework manager model was published and there's a mistake in that model. It could be that your data sources were changed and you're no longer pointing at the correct data source, and it could even be that your underlying data has changed. So this is just one example of how you can make a change, but any source of change whatsoever will be reflected by our testing. Now, our tool actually allows you from right in Report Studio, instead of just saving your change, you can check in a change. And one of the things you can do when you check in a change is you can automatically run any test cases associated with the report that you're saving. And that's what we're going to do here so that we can see if we get any notifications saying, hey, there's a problem with, it could be the properties of the report, it could be with the execution time of the report, or it could be with the data in the report. And of course, that's what we're going to see here is we're going to find out we've got lots of assertions set up to do data validation, and they're going to pretty much all fail now thanks to the change that we just made. So you can see that we've got a failing test case here. We actually have the ability to pop open any of the different output types that we've generated. You can see there's a whole lot of those. But what we're really going to want to do here is drill into this result and take a look and see, wow, there's a whole bunch of different things failing. This is really not what you want to see if you're a report author. And as you look through each of these, you can see we're checking that a certain column in the report is stable. We're doing validation against an external data source for one of our columns. We're comparing this report to another one in the same environment, comparing against fixed values, against spot checking, relative values. We're looking at logical relationships, output comparisons. So we're actually comparing the output to the entire output that we see in production. Output stability, comparing the entire output against what we saw the first time we ran this report. And also a values comparison against, I guess our column here isn't really wide enough, but this is a values comparison against your production environment where we're taking just some of the values from the report and we're comparing them against your production report. So as we look at these different values here, we can see that there's actually plain English explanations in most cases, and you can set them up in all cases, telling me exactly what's going wrong. But what I'd rather do is I'm actually going to go into the MotioCI application so we can see how these expectations are set up so that when we look at these results, we have a better understanding of what they really mean. So here in the MotioCI application, and let me refresh my view so that we can see that the failure is indicated right here in the UI, I can come to this particular test case that's failing. And I do want to note here, as I said earlier, if you're using a QA department, you've probably got test cases defined that tell you, first of all, how to run your report. Because, of course, if you're doing spot checking or even certain logical relationship checking, it's going to matter what parameter values you're submitting when you run the report. And so we actually see that right here, that we've got parameter values that we've submitted just by editing the prompt page right within our application and selecting the parameter values that we want. So you're able to actually predefine the way you want to run your report, including the credentials you want to use if you want to do row-level security checking as part of your data validation. And then you can see underneath that section each of the different assertions that we've set up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through each of them in order, starting from really the simplest all the way out to some of the more in-depth, robust, and powerful assertions that we've got. And so the first type of assertion that I mentioned earlier is the ability to do a comparison against flex values. And in this case, we are looking at the Excel output. You can actually look at any of these different output types and parse data from them. And if I want to edit the set of formulas that I'm verifying here, the spot checking that I'm doing, all I have to do is edit my assertion, and you see I've got a simple UI here where I can actually just basically enter equations that say things like cell B6 should be equal to this value of 4,720. Cell C32 equals 486.04. And to get a little bit more of an understanding of what that means in practice, let's bring up our output so we can really see what it looks like. So here we're looking actually at the HTML output because it's going to display better for us, and I can tell you this right here is the value we're checking with B6. And then down in this area, actually the value, of course, that we had as an expectation isn't showing up anywhere because we went and doubled these values, which is why this all broke. But it would actually be this value right here that's being checked in the other place. And to really prove that out, let's see if we can take a look at the Excel output itself here. And so here we go, cell B6, that's the value we're looking for, and C32. So that's what we were trying to get out of this Excel output and comparing to fixed values that we saw here in our predefined spot checking fixed values assertion. So if you just want to spot check, it's very, very easy to come in and list as many different things to spot check against a single output as you want. I mentioned that you can do logical relationships, and so if we look again at our Excel output, which I should have minimized instead of closing, then what you can see is that this value right here is the total revenue for the product type. These are all the different individual revenue values for the product type. And so it would be really nice if we were concerned about these calculations ever differing, if we could sum these up and compare them to cell B6. And if we look now at the Excel formula with relative values, you can see we've done exactly that. So we said that the value in cell B6 should be equal to the sum of the values in the range C32 to C36. So that's a simple example of taking a range and summing them up. But I do want to note here in terms of data validation, if you're familiar with the Excel formula engine, then you know it's very, very robust. You can do all kinds of crazy things with it. In fact, I know a lot of companies, a lot of smaller companies especially, even use Excel actually as their BI platform. They do all their calculations there. So we expose that entire formula engine to you and allow you to do all kinds of the different logic and everything that can be evaluated by Excel formulas you can build into your testing right here. So those are relative values. Now let's imagine that we want to compare against a previous output. The easiest way to do that in our application, and this is something that you can actually auto-generate right on day one for even entire folders, your entire content store full of reports, is to say basically certain of my reports should be stable. So in other words, their output should not change from one run to the next, which is to say maybe I've gone through development, these have been deployed out into production, and everything looks good to me. So we have an output stability assertion, and if we go into that output stability assertion, then we can see that we're asserting the report output is stable, it's not changing, and we can see we can choose 4 different output types to actually test. And in order to really show you the value of the output stability assertion, instead of just looking at the properties here, let's take a look again at this result that we had from our testing, because the output stability assertion gives you a really neat ability. You can see that it says not only does it tell you which files are not identical, the HTML files and the SQL files and so on, but you can bring up comparisons side by side of those files to see how they've changed. And so in this case, if you imagine that you were investigating this from scratch, you would see on the right-hand side you have your expected output. This is what it used to be. And you see the revenue value is highlighted in orange because it's a change. That's not normally part of the report. That's something that was added by the CI application. And then if we look at the actual output, we can see this revenue value has gone up. And of course, as we know from the fact that we did it, you can see it actually did double. So you have the ability not only to detect changes that occur relative to an expectation, but to do really nice comparisons on the entire output to see exactly what it is that changed from one run to the next. That said, I gave the example earlier where you're working on a report and you choose just maybe one column that should be affected, and you want to list out the other columns, make sure that those don't change. That way you can make sure that those are not affected by any changes that are made, let's say, to the query structure of the report. That's what this column stability assertion is for. And if we look at the values we put into the column stability assertion, There are a lot of extra values, extra settings you can put in here, but the only one you needed to put in order to set this up is just the simple revenue column name. So all I have to do is tell it which column do I want to check for stability, and every time this runs, it's going to check the revenue column and see if it's changed relative to the baseline it establishes on its first run. So once again, coming back and looking at the output, if we look at the column stability assertion, then in this case we can see it's a very simple example, or a very simple output, where it's telling us each of the values it compared and saying to us that they're not equal. Now that was an example here of a very raw output. What I want to show you next is that some of these have much better looking outputs that you can do. And in this case, actually, it looks like I made a mistake in how I set this one up that I missed. But we'll see at least that these are configurable. So the next point is that you are able to do comparisons across reports. And I gave the example of a summary report and a detail report. So let's imagine, for example, that in consumer trends, all those values that are summed up, they're represented as a single value in another report called revenue by product. So if we look at the comparison across reports option here, we've set up this assertion with a more in-depth setting to always go against revenue by product. But again, the only thing you have to do here is enter the column that you want to compare between those two reports. And when you look at the result, you can see here this is actually not resolved correctly because I made a mistake when I set it up. So I need to change those real quick. Let's see if I can fix those in, let's say, 20 seconds or less. So I've got the wrong names in here for So you can see where these messages are coming from. They're actually completely configurable here, where you can actually put in the exact message that you want for your logical purposes. And let's go ahead and let's let this rerun in the background. But the more important thing than seeing a pretty message out of this is to understand that you actually do have the ability to compare between reports. If you have some data in one report, some data in another report, you want to aggregate them together in different ways, then you can do exactly that. I also mentioned the possibility that as you're working on a report in development, you might want to see how it relates to the current value you're getting from production. And that comes down to this output comparison assertion, which compares reports across environments. So if I go into edit the output comparison assertion, you can see this is a very simple one to set up. It's going to just look in my production environment, or whatever environment's name I choose to enter here, and it's going to compare this list of outputs that I select. And so once again, now if I look at the results for this, this test case, then I can see when I look at the output comparison, just like before, just like with the output stability assertion, I can see all of the diffs and I can get to those comparisons. One thing that I like to highlight here is we actually can generate for you the SQL that's used to run the report. So in a way, that's another form of data validation. You can actually see what's happening in terms of what you're sending to the database. And here you see we snuck in that ×2, which is why that part of the SQL is showing up different. And then finally, and the thing I really want to spend the most time on here, is the idea that you can take your data from your underlying data warehouse, from your transactional system, from really any other data source that you really could think of, and you can bring that into scope for testing against your report's outputs. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, I missed one there. Before I move on from comparing against another environment, we have an assertion here that's going to do comparisons against production of just certain values that you select. And this one's pretty cool. Basically, what you're saying is that you want to take some different formulas here, B6, sum of C32 to C36, so those two key formulas. We're going to run them against both the local output and the output pulled from production, and we're going to make sure that those values come out the same. And if not, we're going to fail. So you can select only a portion of the report that you want to make sure is identical to production. So again, if you have a column that's well defined in production, you don't want to risk it being broken, you can set this up to keep an eye on that column even as other columns are actively being worked on. And then finally, we come to the column validation assertion, which is really pretty much our favorite new assertion that we have, because it gives you the idea that you can actually do validation against your underlying data warehouse. So first off, when I bring up this prompt page, you'll see there is a lot going on here. But it turns out that it's actually surprisingly easy to set up. So first off, you do need to say which data source you want to connect to. You can see that this query section, you're putting the actual SQL that will run against your data source. And then you're just putting in the parameters that you want to submit as part of the prepared statement that will be run with this query. You're saying how you want to compare it. So you're saying in this case you're testing for equality. And then you're just saying you want to compare against the XML output from this test case. And you want to read the revenue column name. So coming into this, the hardest part, of course, is going to be to figure out the SQL. It actually turns out that with our application, that's pretty easy to do, again, thanks to this SQL output that we provide for you. In order to set up this assertion, all I actually did was I copied this whole block of information from query 1.2. I just copied that and pasted it in. And then I just removed some of the other selections up here because I only wanted to look at the revenue value. That is literally all I did to set up this comparison against my underlying data warehouse. And if I look at the results of that comparison in the column validation, then I can see here it's actually listing out the query value and the column values, and it's telling me if their comparisons are coming out true or false. So right here I can see what the query is giving me, what the actual column value is. Easy for me to figure out where those values are coming from, and hopefully in most cases it'll be just as easy to figure out what the problem is noticing that these are being doubled. But I will mention also that when you pair the information you get in terms of finding problems with our testing, when you combine that with our ability with version control to show you how an object has changed over time, it becomes a whole lot easier to find out where problems in your data are coming from. So to wrap up, before I hand over to our Q&A conversation, I do want to mention that we've only just scratched the surface in terms of the ways you can bring data into the application. You can pull data also from a command script that can be run on the server that CI runs on. And when you think of the flexibility of command scripts, that opens up a whole lot of options. We can pull data from a HTTP request. So if you have a web service, for example, you can actually pull data from your web service or push data to your web service using our testing. You can pull values from the CI server's file system as well. So any files you place on the CI server can be used as sources of data for testing. And actually there are several more examples even beyond that. And once you've got the data in scope, there's just a huge number of things you can do with it. Even just in terms of arithmetic, you can add, subtract, multiply, divide, of course. You can also do statistics like means and averages, standard deviations. You can do logical operations. You can do string manipulation operations. There's really not many limits to what you can do. So with that, I will actually turn over for any questions that we might have. And I think Roger can maybe list out a couple questions for us.
Sure. I've been watching on the chat window, and if anybody does have a question, go ahead and put those in. I pulled out a few of the ones that have been asked, and I'll go ahead and read those to you, Adam, and then you can provide an answer. So one of the participants was asking, says you showed comparing the results of a SQL query to a report output, and they want to know what databases you can run that SQL against.
All right, so currently we support SQL Server, Oracle, and DB2. We're also working on adding support for Teradata, and I believe there are some others as well. I'd have to check with the developer who's working on that. But basically, we're building up that list over time, and we're also open to hearing from any customers or prospects which databases they'd be interested in being able to query against.
Okay. And I guess sort of specifically to this question, they wanted to know, are you limited to the databases, the data sources that are defined in Cognos?
Absolutely not. So actually, as I mentioned, in Cognos you may only have your data warehouse defined, but you could actually pull data directly from your transactional system or from any other database whatsoever. So you can configure additional external data sources in the MotioCI application beyond the ones that are listed in Cognos.
And I'm looking at this list of questions here, and some of them are pretty similar, so I'm actually going to consolidate. People want to know when these test cases get executed. One person was asking if that was on a schedule, and somebody else wanted to know, could that be set up so that they're run when the objects have changed? So can you just talk a little bit about when these test cases actually get executed?
Sure, and I can actually show that just a little bit. What we do in order to run test cases is we define things called test scripts. And a test script is basically, it's a set of criteria for picking out the test cases that you want to run. So when you set up a test script, instead of adding just a fixed list of test cases to it, you say, what are the rules for figuring out which test cases currently belong to the test script? In this case, for example, we have a test script that's only going to run test cases that have had some kind of change or else that failed on their last run in order to see if they'll run again. So if you wanted to run your reports comparatively less often, you can use this to say you only want to run reports that have changed. Then once you've defined a test script, you can schedule it to run on a regular basis. You can choose certain times of day and certain days of the week, or you can have it run on a frequency. So you can have these run as often as you want if you really need to check a certain thing in your environment very, very frequently. And you can also configure these test scripts to set up emails to a list of recipients associated with what we call a project, so that you can actually get an email in your inbox letting you know if the data in one of your reports is coming out incorrectly.
And I think a couple of these actually you already answered probably in your summary, and maybe people put the question in before you spoke, because they're asking, you showed the SQL one, and they want to know if you can compare, an output of a report or other object to the result of a web service, for example, or a file, which I believe you did address that, right?
Yeah, you absolutely can, and we give you lots of great tools for picking out that information. So for example, if you were defining some of your expectations in an RSS feed, you would be able to very easily pull that into our application and parse out the data values from that RSS feed.
Okay, and here's one. Somebody wants to know, your example was a report, and they want to know what other object types within Cognos they can add test cases to.
Sure. So what you can do is you can add executable test cases, which are the ones that are used to generate the data that we use here. You can add those to reports, queries, analyses, and interactive reports. And in addition to that, one of the tools that you have available in our assertions is the ability to query Cognos. And of course, Cognos represents the outputs in the content store, so you could actually test against your saved outputs in Cognos, parse those out, and look at the data values there.
Okay. And someone else was asking, can you create more than one test case for a given object?
Absolutely. You can have as many different test cases as you like. So for example, if you wanted to have a second test case on consumer trends that uses different parameters, it's as easy to add as just saying add test case. You can give it whatever name you like, choose your output types and so on. You can choose which assertions you want to automatically generate. And you can automatically pull parameters either from other test cases or parameters that are saved in your Cognos environment. And in this case, let's say we don't want to use those same parameters. All we have to do is go to the prompt page and choose different values. And then we can test the data corresponding to those values.
Okay. And one more that we have here, someone wants to know what other things they can test besides output, and specifically they were interested in testing the security that's defined on their objects within IBM Cognos.
Sure. So this is just one special case of our testing. You can test any type of object in your Cognos environment, any property of that object. And of course, when it comes to security, that's always defined as the membership of your different groups and roles, and also as the policy sets on various objects. So actually, if we take a look at some of these different group and role objects here in the Cognos namespace, you can see we've got an assertion that's going to make sure their membership doesn't change unexpectedly. In the same way, you can look at, let's say, a package or a folder. In this case, I think we've got it set up on a folder here. You can test to see, actually, I guess we didn't set it up. You can add a test to see if there are any changes made to the policy settings on a given object. So between those two things, you can actually find out if anybody, for any reason, is going to have a change to what they're able to access in terms of read, write, traverse, execute, set policy in your Cognos environment.
And I think we're getting close. I'm looking to Holly here, but I think we're getting close to the end of time. So we'll go ahead and wrap up. If you've submitted a question, we'll be sure and reply via email and make sure that we answer that question.
All right. Thanks, Adam. Thank you, Roger. And thank you again to everyone for joining us today. You will receive an email early next week with all 3 recordings from the webinar series, so be on the lookout for that in your inbox. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks.